Today I'm going to put the binding on this little quilt, and I already have it ready for binding. I have a sleeve up at the top and it's basted on, so when I put the binding on, it's going to be hooked in there. I usually put a couple of pins down to keep that sleeve from flipping up when I'm working on it. The label is basted, so it's going to be hooked into the binding. And I normally start my binding on one side. I usually start on the right side. I pin it sort of near the top, and then I come down about, I don't know, maybe 16 to 18 inches and put another pin. This is where I'm actually going to be sewing. I'm going to start sewing right here, and I'm going to sew down to the corner, and I will show you that with it as soon as I get started. But I wanted to show you the whole quilt first to get an idea of how I get started. And my machine is set up for, I use a slightly bigger stitch, maybe a 3.0 stitch, because I'm going through more than one layer. I also have my quilting foot, or an even feed foot, because it's a quilt. It's going to need that special foot on there. And I'm going to get started sewing in just a sec. Okay, I have the quilt under the machine, and I am using the even feed foot here. I'm going to kind of watch this little mark, and I usually, for the binding, I make sort of a liberal 1/4 inch seam. And so I'm going to put my needle down and hold these ends, and I am going to do a back stitch. Well, I'm going to do a front stitch, I guess, and then I'll do a little back stitch. And usually when I finish, I go over that stitch too. Probably I would use a like a brown thread, since I'm on this brownish fabric, but I'm using this, what's in my machine, because I am. I tend to like to put pins down, so I have to, as I get close to the bottom, to where the corner is, I will put a pin about 1/4 inch from the end of the, before the end of the corner. That pin will tell me that I'm getting right there. I think I'm just very close there. Yeah, maybe one more stitch. And now I am not going, I'm lifting the foot and flipping the camera. That's what I'm doing. Okay. This is kind of tricky when you have so many things down in the way. Okay, so I'm flipping the whole quilt sideways. I'm going to put the foot back down, and I usually just go straight out, back stitch off the edge. And then I'm going to lift my needle, lift the foot, and pull him out of the way. All right. It would be nice if my camera would quit moving. Now I'm going to turn the binding sideways, and then I'm going to turn it back on himself this way, so that I can get a nice squared corner. And when I have it folded like that, I put another pin right down here. This will just hold it until I can get it under the machine, and let's hope the camera doesn't go jumping around. It might. I'm gonna move it over. Wouldn't it be nice if everything was easy to see? Okay, so now I'm coming from the, let me move this camera around again. Okay, so now I'm moving, there's a pin under there, and I'm going to, I sometimes kind of hold these threads because there's some extra threads hanging out there, and sometimes the sewing machine wants to grab them up and make sort of a knot. We don't want that. So I'm going to start from the edge and start sewing, and I'll get that pin out of the way. Then I'm going to just sew straight on this side at 1/4 of an inch from the edge. And now I'm going to go right across this edge. Notice the raw edges are on the edge and the fold is in the center, or in the middle of the quilt. If you get that messed up, you're gonna have to undo it. Basically straight sewing. When I get to this next corner, I'm going to deal with it in the same way I did the other two, and then I will show you how we finish up. This is going to be just straight sewing down the sides. Now I have sewed all the way around the outside edges, and I'm back to where I started. But I have a good 18 inches there. So I'm going to take my binding and open it up, and I am going to lay it over to the side, like that. And I just take a ruler that has a diagonal 45-degree line on it. I lay this so, so I have maybe 5 inches sticking out here. And then my rotary cutter, and I'm going to cut this off. That is extra. But this piece is really important. I'm going to lay these 2 pieces out and open this one up. Lay this piece on top of it so it's nice and flat. And where it lands, I'm going to make a mark. Now, I thought maybe a white mark. This isn't a very good pencil, but it kind of gives an idea. This is where it ends. And notice it's heading that direction. So I take this and over to the side. I am going to, now this is the important part. I am not going to lay the edge of the ruler on that line, because then I will have no seam area. You have to allow yourself a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to lay the ruler on so that this 1/2 inch line is right on that white line. And then I'm going to trim it off. Now, I take the ends and I am going to line them up together. Sometimes you have to pull the quilt to sort of get yourself in the way. Line them up together, and you're going to have a 1/4 inch point sticking out over on one end and a 1/4 inch mark sticking out on the other end. And so I put pins in here, these are big pins. I don't usually use that big. And then I'm going to take the whole thing under the sewing machine. And if you can get in there, basically all you're interested in doing is making a seam at 1/4 of an inch. And for this, I take the seam length down to 2.0 or something. I don't want that big 3.0 because we don't want it to show. So, and sometimes I knot it, but I'm not gonna really. Now then, it just popped right out there. But when it's seamed together, you want to, I usually try to finger press this seam open just so it doesn't put a lot of bulk in the seam. And then just pull the binding out so that it matches on either side, on both ends. Put more pins in, and I will stitch this. I will start back a little bit, stitch down until I pass where I started. And then the binding is all ready to flip over to the back side. Stitched around, then I take it to the ironing board and I turn the edges to the back. I press them really good. I pin them, or I use the little clips to hold them. And then when you get to your corners, when you have you can flip one side down and flip the other side right over it in a nice 45-degree angle. So then, after you've stitched this by hand on the back, then you will need to stitch your sleeve down too. And hopefully have a name for your quilt. I am now hand stitching the binding on the back of this quilt, and I wanted you to see how you do a nice blind stitch. I already have done some, so you thread your needle and hide it under the binding and use matching thread and take a stitch and go inside the batting and the backing, making sure that you're not coming over and showing on the front. But you're inside there, you go over, maybe 1/4 of an inch, pull it, and then take your next stitch. From right there, you're gonna go straight down, perpendicular to where you were, inside again, making sure that you don't, sometimes it's easy. You feel that it's not coming through. And keep going all the way around your quilt. And one thing you want to watch when you do a corner is you want to stitch up the inside of the back, and also take your needle through and make a couple of stitches on the front side to get that nice, so it sticks together and it will look very nice. And it's very difficult to see the stitching when you do a blind stitch on the back of your quilt. Thank you for watching. And if you feel like you learned something from this presentation, go ahead and hit that like button. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe so you'll be notified when the next video comes along.